today we're going to be talking about access control in form of a case study. So this case study is going to reflect what I would do if I was to come into an organization and evaluate a specific element of said organization. So today the topic is access control, who has access to what, and I'm going to be going through a fictional startup to discuss how I would solve the problems that have been outlined here. So the first thing is to diagnose the access problem first. So I'm going to investigate within the fictional startup, and I'm going to list some red flags, and then for each issue that I find, I'm going to turn it into a practical fix. And the idea is that if you spot something similar in your organization, you can apply the same thing. So meet the made-up startup, BrightFlow. So BrightFlow is a fast-growing SaaS startup. They move quickly. They have several cloud tools. So note that not on-premise at all, as most modern organizations are. And now a large client has asked them for security evidence. So the equivalent of a client due diligence. And the onus is on BrightFlow to express what their current security practices are. But it may well be a case where they realize there are areas of improvement that they need to also fix in the same process. So the team has 18 employees, so full-time or part-time staff, permanent members of the organization, 7 contractors, so people that are there on a temporary basis, whether for a few months, a few years, but nonetheless temporary people, and then 2 agencies, so external companies that are coming in to do work for them. And the tools they use is Google Workspace, AWS, so the cloud, GitHub, Slack, and HubSpot. So the pressure is there's a client questionnaire, so they need to outline what their current practices are. So to do that, they need to know what the practices are in the first place. A contractor has left, so related to access control, what needs to happen. And then the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, is unsure who has access, which is a key concern. So what would you want to know first? So I'm going to give some context first and list and talk about access control. So access control is about who has access to what in terms of whether it's system resources, applications, file shares, etc. So for context, we always apply least privilege. So we give people the least amount of information they need to complete their role. So the least amount of access control. So I'll go back to the analogy of keys. You have a building with 100 doors, and person A only needs access to 3 doors, 3% of the organization. Rather than giving them a bunch of keys that has every single key in the organization, giving them just 3 so that they can do their job. Another example related to keys would be just-in-time access. So let's say once in a while or on a one-off basis, employee A needs access to a 4th room. You give them the key on the day of. Once they finish with the key, they give it back to you, just-in-time access. So you're just giving them just what they need when they need it, and then once they don't need it anymore, you're revoking it. And then privileged access is the equivalent of giving someone access to the vault. So let's say there's 2 rooms that have vaults, you give them privileged keys, but rather than having it on their main set of keys, you give them a second set of keys that they keep safely somewhere. And then when they need access to the privileged areas like the vaults, they use that set of keys. They use it, they put it back, and that's it. They don't have it on their main set of keys that they walk around with. So the equivalent of that is, let's say, or an explanation as to why it's important to keep it like that is that if I was to lose my bunch of keys that has 3 sets of keys on it out of the 100, if an attacker was to come in, they can only access those 3 rooms. Whereas if they have my privileged keys, they have access to the high value things within the organization. So me having the normal set of keys and the privileged keys together is a bad idea. And it's most of the time unnecessary, especially if I only use it sometimes. So what would I want to know? And what would I ask BrightFlow? So my first question is always going to be, what are your critical systems? So critical systems are things that if an attacker was to attack or to bring down, it's going to have a significant impact on your organization. So the equivalent of payroll or your website, depending on the nature of your business. So for BrightFlow, it might be the equivalent of Amazon Web Services, assuming everything is hosted within there. That's an area that is very important, and if it was to go down or if it was to be damaged in any way, then it would have a high impact on the organization. So just start there. And then once you understand what the critical systems are, understand who has access to that. So you should be able to have a list and say, 2 people in the marketing team, 3 people in this part of the team, you need to have a strong understanding of who has access to it and the level of access they have. Do they have read only? Do they have write? Do they have admin? And that leads on nicely to my next question. Who has admin access? So admin access is that elite set of keys that lead into the vault. It is important to make sure that not everyone has access to it. And then, like I mentioned before about just-in-time access, what is the nature of the activities that they undergo using the privileged keys? If they need to use it on a daily basis, it might be suitable for them to have standing access, long-standing access. But if it's something they use once a week, twice a week, on like a temporary basis, it doesn't make sense to expose your organization to that level of risk and have it as standing access. So that's where you'd consider something like just-in-time. Next. So this is assuming that I've done the audit of the organization and this is what I found. So nobody has a complete access view. This is very, very dangerous. So you don't have a complete view of systems or complete list of systems. This means that if you needed to build operational resilience, so being able to rebound and restart after business disruption, you don't have a list of what you need to recover. So you're going to be in a very tricky position just to start. No clear system owners. If there's no ownership, there's no accountability. So there's no one to hold accountable if anything goes wrong, or to hold accountable when it comes to access reviews or anything like that. If no one owns it, typically it's not going to be done. No admin access register. You need to have a true understanding of who has access in terms of admin. Admin is very, very powerful. So if someone is an admin user and they leave the organization, you need to make sure that you close that account as they leave to make sure that it's not left as like a dormant account that an attacker could take over. No contractor access review. Due to the nature of contractors, it's possible that contractors leave the organization within a short period, leaving their account unaccounted for. Again, you need to make sure that as contractors are joining, moving and leaving your organization, you're reviewing that on a periodic basis to make sure that their access is being adjusted accordingly. And then no shared account inventory. In general, shared accounts, so for example, a mailbox where 5 or 6 people are logging in and taking action is typically a no-no. It's not practical for one resource to be used by multiple people that are not named. So the best example I can give is that, let's say you have an online banking account that disperses payments. If you have 5 people in that account making transactions and a transaction is done incorrectly, or you notice there's some anomalies in how things are being done, there's some things that are not adding up, it's difficult to trace who exactly did what. In an innocent example where someone has made a mistake, or in a malicious example where an attacker has gained access to said account and are making changes or sending payments that are not approved. So it's always a no-no to use a shared account. But in the instance where you don't have a choice and you must use a shared account, there has to be inventory to make sure there's accountability. So the first red flag. Former contractor still has access. So a contractor has left 6 months ago, but still has access to Slack, GitHub, and AWS console access. That is very, very dangerous, because when a contractor leaves, I'm going to give 2 examples. So an innocent example is that they still have access to, let's say, proprietary information, so information that is confidential to your organization, or alternatively, if the account is left dormant, it's possible that an attacker can take hold of that account and use it for malicious intent. And because the contractor no longer works there, you don't have it in mind to check on it, because you just assume that they're not going to be there. So the fix for this is to create a joiners, movers and leavers process. So joiners being people that have joined your organization, movers people that have gone from one department to another, making it necessary to adjust their access, and then leaver, someone that's left the organization altogether, someone whose access you need to revoke. Next, you need to disable accounts and remove groups, and then revoke MFA devices. So you need to go through all your systems and revoke them one by one. That's where having a list of systems that each individual has, or based on their role, each individual has, and making sure that as they leave, you open a ticket and individually tick off each thing that needs to be revoked. And then review shared credentials. So let's say they're using shared credentials as used in the previous example. That means you need to change the password to make sure that if they still happen to, especially in a SaaS environment, if they have access to the URL, then their credentials will not work if they try to log in again. And then the question here is, what would happen if the account was misused? It could go as far as making unauthorized changes, access to data that they no longer have a need for. The damage can be quite high because when you have an uncontrolled resource, it's difficult to determine how it will be used, whether it's an attacker or the former employee. Red flag number 2, too many admins. So Google Workspace has 18 users and 14 super admins. So super admins are people that need excessive amounts of privileges. So think of that first example of the set of keys that have like vault access. Everybody does not need that. If you find that everyone needs that, then there's a breakdown in process, and you need to evaluate how to limit that, and maybe bring in just-in-time access or something like that to reduce the amount of damage that can be done. So imagine 14 sets of keys that can be lost in a street near your organization. It's at best, it's risky. At worst, it can bring down your organization. Admin access becoming too normal. Again, assess the practices that are leading to that, because as startups, I know sometimes it's easy to grant a lot of access because it's convenient, or to keep things moving, or to remove blockers quickly, but always try to dial back from that, make it a temporary thing, always month to month or week to week, evaluate where you can remove access, and don't look at removing access as like a bad thing. Just add some governance around it to make sure that people understand that it's based on reducing risk as opposed to because they're not trusted. So for example, you can bring in a workflow that requires some approval for admin access. So someone is able to request access to do a specific task, maybe for like 2 or 3 hours, and then once it's done, it automatically expires until they need it again later on. So try to build some workflows around automating, so creating workflows that will allow you to grant access as needed. So the fix here is to apply least privilege. So something else to note here is that when it comes to user accounts or user roles, try to create role-based access. So list the amount of permissions and activities that each role does, and then that will make clear where you need to have some level of, whether it's privileged access versus standard access, or just try to make it a bit more standardized. So let's say people in marketing, this is the level of admin they need if they're like a manager or something. Same with IT, same with finance. Try to make it quite systemized so it's something you refer to as opposed to something you do ad hoc. That will make it easier to control, especially if people are moving from different roles within the organization. Next, limit admin rights. So create named admin roles. So I like to be quite granular. So rather than having a generalized admin role, you might set up an admin role for a specific thing. So that means you can assign said role to a person. They only have access to the activities or the permissions they need for that privileged activity. And then once you're done, it's either revoked, or even if they have to have standing access, the amount they can do is very, very limited. And then use stronger checks for privileged access. So it has to be justified. Just because someone had it before or someone wants it doesn't mean they should be given it automatically. And then what happens if one admin account is compromised? What we need to remember here is that privileged accounts have elevated privileges. So that means that they're able to approve payments, provision access. They have a lot more that they can do. So just imagine an attacker being able to complete the same actions that an admin account can, and that will kind of drive home how important it is to limit the amount of privileged access accounts that you have, or to monitor them quite tightly. 3, shared accounts. As previously mentioned, shared accounts are not a good idea. We need to have accountability. So the marketing team use one shared login for campaigns, analytics, and customer exports. So it looks like there's multiple people using one account. So that means that if Sarah uses the account or John uses the account, we don't know who did what. So if Sarah, John, and an attacker is using the same account, there's no difference. We don't know. And then the fix for this is individual accounts. So every single user needs their own identity, multi-factor authentication, and permissions, and an audit trail. So to add more context to this, if we have different individuals that are logging in, so using the example of John and Sarah, if John and Sarah both have, let's say John is based in the UK, Sarah is based in the States, and they have different working hours and they have different behavior that is normal. They have specific devices that they normally log into. It's easy to check for, it's easy to build a profile for normal behavior for both of them. Whereas if there's multiple people using the same account and suddenly someone logs in from Japan or something, it's easy to flag that as an issue because that is so far from normal behavior. And that's why it's important to have individual accounts with multi-factor authentication, and also the ability for signals to be sent so we can apply conditional access. So conditional access being making sure that we take into account risk as well as authentication before giving someone access to a resource. So the question here is, can you prove who changed, exported or deleted data? That's where having individual accounts becomes important. Red flag number 4, access reviews never happen. So nobody has reviewed access for 2 years, old permissions are still active. In a startup, I'm just going to flag that it's particularly dangerous, especially in the early days, because people are given access to almost everything very, very permissively in the beginning because of practicality. But the point you need to remember is that once time goes on, people move into different roles, you start acquiring a crazy amount of access. So think of that original set of keys. Let's say you've got the privileged keys, your normal keys, all on one set of keys. So in that 100-door building, you have the equivalent of 56 keys. If you were to lose that set of keys in the street and someone was to come into the building, they have access to half of your organization, basically over half of your organization, all because you have what we call scope creep. You have way more access than you need, and we're not applying least privilege. Where access reviews become powerful is that the system owner goes through the list. Well, normally in a big organization, the system owner sends access controls this to managers, and managers go through the list for each system and they indicate what is needed and what isn't needed. And in that way, whether it's on a quarterly basis or it could be on a quarterly basis for normal access, but for privileged access, we tend to do it weekly, fortnightly, monthly at a push. But ideally on a weekly basis, just checking, should this person have access still? If the answer is yes, fine. If the answer is no, revoke access. So the fix to this is quarterly access reviews. So still maintaining that if it's a very high risk system or really privileged system, review it more frequently than that. And then check users, groups, vendors, contractors. Vendors and contractors are quite, as well as admins, are quite high risk because they have, sometimes they have high turnover, they can leave quite last minute and still have access available. At this point, you can connect your joiners, movers and leavers process to this, especially focusing on movers and leavers. So making sure that as people move through the organization, you're making sure that their old access is being revoked. And that's where having role-based access templates where you can see exactly the amount of access each role has, even if it evolves over time, become very, very helpful for making sure that you revoke access on a timely basis. So, red flag number 5, vendor access is unclear. So as an external agency has website analytics and a customer database access, no one knows why. So it's possible that in the course of business, you had to give them access for a specific purpose, but you didn't revoke it in the end. So for this, create third-party access governance. So create a process for making sure that access is revoked from vendors in a timely manner. And on top of that, make sure that you're monitoring the process to make sure it's happening properly. So governance is one side of things, so creating a process for making sure that things happen in a certain way. But then you always want to check your own work and make sure that it's going as you hoped it to. And if it isn't going as you hoped it to, rather than almost like hitting the gavel, make sure you ask if people are resisting the process, understand if there's a flaw in the design of the process or if there's any other reason that people aren't following the process, because people always take the path of least resistance. So just make sure you're picking something that is in line, that makes it easier for people to follow as opposed to not. And then approve, limit, document, review and expire vendor access. So let's say you've got a 3-month engagement, have it so their access automatically expires at the end of that period. If they have to extend it, fine. It's easier to raise a ticket and extend it than to have someone that has standing access, especially if they're a vendor. So, in conclusion, BrightFlow does not have a tool problem. They have issues around ownership. So there isn't ownership around systems and processes. They don't have an access review rhythm, so it's not the way they do access reviews is not systematic. There is no leavers process, so there's no way of making sure that leavers are offboarded from the organization and their access is removed. they have far too many admins, so the risk of an attacker hijacking an existing admin account and doing damage is high. They have many entry points. And then it has unclear vendor access. So that means when third parties come in, they're almost treated like permanent staff, and they don't have expiring access. So, access control health check. If you can't answer these questions, then access control is probably a business risk for you. So who has access to what? Who has admin rights? Who joined this month? Who left this month? I'll also add in who moved this month. So who moved from what department to what? And then which vendors have access, when was access last reviewed, which accounts are dormant, and which shared accounts exist. So start here. I like to start with access control in any organization because I feel like access control is, like I said, it's like an entry point into the organization. So if you can lock this down, then you're in a very good position, and it's a very high leverage activity. So this is the solution. Access becomes a process. So assets, you list your key systems, what is important to you. List your key systems, and also like maybe add a star next to the ones that are critical, and then start with the critical ones. And then owners, assign system owners. Every single system must have an owner to ensure accountability. Users, know who has access, like know in detail who has access, and know the type of access they have. So is it standard access? Is it admin access? Is it super admin access? And then review. Have a process for checking access regularly. So depending on how significant it is, so if it's a really high risk system or high risk account, so admin account, make sure it's on a weekly or monthly basis at the least. And then if it's a standard account, make sure that access is done on a quarterly basis. So the goal is simple. The right people have the right access for the right reason and the right amount of time. And then in terms of sequencing, what should BrightFlow do first? Create a critical systems and owners list, and then run an admin, contractor, and vendor access review. The first one that you do is likely to be the most messy and the most corrective, and after that you should just be doing small tweaks because you're doing it on a regular basis. But try not to feel too overwhelmed. If you're crunched for time, start off with admin, work through that, and then move on to contractor and vendor, or have a team that you meet up with on a regular basis and send out the initial emails to us, the heads, like the department heads or management, to see who needs access, whose access needs to be adjusted. And then create a joiner, mover, and leaver checklist, and review the existing access to make sure that people are being offboarded at the right points. And then just like as a final thing, access control is business protection. So the value isn't in the amount of process that comes about because of this, but rather the fact that you know exactly who has access to what. There's accountability in terms of fixing problems, and the likelihood of your accounts being hijacked by an attacker becomes lower because you've reduced the attack surface. I have a couple of products that are aimed at fixing this. So we've got 2 DIY style products. So I call the first one Layer 1 Startup Security Toolkit. So this is for a founder that doesn't have much cybersecurity knowledge. There's an entire module dedicated to access control to support you in establishing the processes that I've discussed in this case study. The next one is a security implementation kit. So these are for people that have a better understanding of security, but they need practical tools to actually implement these things. So rather than thinking of the how, they just want to get into the what. And then thirdly, I have a security readiness audit. So let's say you have a specific area of your business that you'd like me to have a look at and to give you a improvement plan for. This is what the security readiness audit includes. And then lastly, if you have a specific project that you'd like help with, but you don't necessarily want to get a full-time hiring, then this is also something that's suitable. All of these items will be listed in my bio and available for purchase on my website. But yeah, if you're ready to fix access control, either book a consultation or start with the right startup security layer based on the current stage of your business. Thank you.